The night it all began didn't look like the beginning of anything at all. It looked like the end of me. The banquet hall glittered under crystal chandeliers, their light refracting across polished silverware, golden-rimmed plates, and glasses filled to the brim with sparkling champagne. Waiters in crisp black and white uniforms floated silently through the room, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked too perfect to eat. Every surface shone, every corner pulsed with laughter, every detail screamed wealth and power. My family had spared no expense on this celebration, because in their eyes, appearances were everything. I sat stiffly at the table, my fingers clutching the edge of my napkin until it wrinkled beyond repair. I wanted to disappear into the floor as I listened to the sound of laughter echoing across the room. Laughter aimed at the man sitting quietly beside me, the man who had done nothing but try to love me. My partner, the man my family called a loser. He sat there calm, his posture straight, his eyes downcast, his fork moving methodically through the untouched meal on his plate. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even defensive. His silence was his shield, and he wore it like armor. But every joke, every mocking word thrown across the table like a dagger sliced into me deeper than I could bear. "Did you drive that old car again?" my cousin sneered, sipping from her champagne flute. "I saw you pull up earlier. I didn't even think those things still ran." "My God, what year is it from? 2002? Laughter erupted. My uncle chimed in, "If he's smart, he'll keep it. Might be a classic someday." "That's probably the best investment he'll ever make." More laughter, more clinking glasses, more eyes turning toward him like vultures circling prey. My partner didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He simply lifted his glass, sipped slowly, and set it back down without a word. But my chest burned with humiliation. They weren't just mocking him. They were mocking me. My choice, my love, my future. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap across the table and silence them all. But the words lodged in my throat, suffocated by the weight of loyalty. This was my family. These were the people.
She'll be the one paying the bills. Always has, always will. Isn't that right? The table roared with laughter. Forks clinked against plates, champagne glasses tipped back, and the room buzzed with mockery disguised as merriment. My face burned hot. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned to look at him, my partner, begging, for some flicker of reaction. Anger, hurt, shame, anything. But his expression remained unreadable, calm, collected, almost amused? It stunned me. Here I was, drowning in humiliation, and he sat steady, a quiet storm no one else seemed to notice. He didn't rise to their bait, didn't beg for respect, didn't play their game. And it was in that moment, watching his composure, that I felt something unexpected creep through my veins. Not shame, not despair, but loyalty, fierce, unshakable loyalty. I reached for his hand under the table, threading my trembling fingers through his steady ones. His grip tightened, firm, grounding me like an anchor in the middle of a storm. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. That touch told me everything. I can take this. You don't have to. But the cruelty didn't stop. My family smelled blood and they were relentless. "Imagine the wedding," my cousin mocked. "What's he gonna do? Serve beer out of a cooler? Host it in a garage?" Laughter again. My father chuckled, shaking his head in disappointment, though he didn't join in with words. His silence was worse. His silence was an agreement. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. The shame, the anger, the heartbreak, it all swirled in me like a hurricane. My family, the people who claimed to love me, were humiliating the man I loved in front of me. And he, the man they called a loser, sat there unbothered, as though he were holding a secret the rest of them were too blind to see. And maybe he was, because as the laughter faded into idle chatter, he leaned toward me, his lips brushing against my ear. His voice was low, calm, deliberate. "Don't let them break you," he whispered. "They don't know who I really..." I froze, my fork suspended in midair, my mind.
We stepped out into the cold night air. I felt the shift. The storm was brewing, but it wasn't in me. It was in him. And for the first time I wondered, who exactly was the man my family had just mocked? Because what none of them knew that night was the truth about the man they were mocking. They thought he was invisible. They thought he was unworthy. But I knew better, because I loved the man they couldn't see. When I look back on that night, the night my family mocked the man I love in front of everyone, what hurts me most is not the words themselves, but how easily they believed them. The laughter, the whispers, the pitying glances, all of it cut through me like glass. Because to them he was just a nobody, a man with no sparkle, no prestige, no pedigree. But to me he was everything. And it still astonishes me how two groups of people could look at the same man and see two completely different versions of him. My family saw the surface. They saw the old car with faded paint and the tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper. They noticed his clothes, neat but plain, shirts that had been ironed too many times, shoes without logos, jackets that looked like they had been worn through winters long before he met me. They saw a job title that didn't impress them. Manager at a local hardware store. In their eyes, this wasn't success. It wasn't enough. They had raised me on ideas of ambition and appearances, of prestige and wealth, and to them the man I chose fell short of every expectation. But I saw what they didn't. I saw the man who opened doors not because it was performative, but because he genuinely believed in kindness. I saw the way his hands, calloused from years of hard work, would soften whenever he reached for mine. I noticed how he listened, really listened when I spoke, even to the little things, like how I take my coffee or which songs make me cry. He never forgot those details because to him they mattered. And when I was with him, I felt something my family's world of glitter and judgment had never given me. I remember one evening, long before the nightmare dinner party, when we were driving back from the countryside. His old car rattled along the road, and I trusted him with my whole heart. But in the quiet corners of my mind, I sometimes wondered, why the secrecy? Why the hesitations? What was he protecting? Of course, those questions seemed small compared to the love we shared. To me, they were details. My family, however, only saw what was missing. They measured him against a scale of wealth and status and declared him lacking. And in their judgment, they labeled him the one word that still burns when I remember it: loser. That night, as I sat there watching them mock him, I couldn't help but think of all the things they would never understand. They didn't see the man who once stood in line for hours just to buy me a book I mentioned in passing, because he wanted me to know my dreams mattered. They didn't see the man who spent weekends fixing his neighbor's broken fences for free, because he believed in helping without asking for anything in return. They didn't see the man who held me when I cried, who told me I wasn't too much or too little, who reminded me every single day that love is not about what you have, but about what you give. What broke me that night wasn't just their laughter. It was the loneliness of sitting in a room full of people I had loved all my life and realizing they didn't care enough to look deeper. They judged the cover without reading the story. And in doing so, they insulted the man who had given me more than any of them ever had. But he didn't flinch. That's what amazed me. When the jokes came, when the whispers circled, he simply smiled. He sat there with his calm demeanor, sipping his water, nodding politely, never once letting their mockery rattle him. Later, when I asked him how he could stand it, he squeezed my hand and said, "People who laugh the loudest usually don't know what matters most." I held on to that. I held on to him. Because in that moment, I realized something important. Love isn't tested when the world applauds you. Love is tested when the world laughs at you, and you choose to stay anyway. And I stayed. But deep inside, I knew there was more to him than he let on. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a kind of calm strength that didn't match the picture my family painted of him. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't bitter, and he never once acted like a man ashamed of his life. That puzzled me. If he truly were the loser they thought he was, wouldn't it sting more? Impress. When I was growing up, I thought my family was extraordinary. They weren't rich by old money standards, but they worked tirelessly to climb higher on the social ladder. They believed appearances were everything.
that respect was earned not by kindness or humility, but by status, wealth, and who you were seen with. Dinner conversations weren't about dreams or feelings. They were about who got promoted, who bought a new house, whose children got into the best schools. Success, to them, was the only language worth speaking. At first, I thought this was normal. I thought every family judged so harshly, weighed love on a scale of worthiness, and withheld praise unless you dazzled. But as I got older, I began to see the cracks. My cousins who pursued art instead of law were ridiculed as impractical. My brother's girlfriend, who came from a modest background, was dismissed as a charity case unfit for him. Even my own past boyfriends were scrutinized, one for not making enough money, another for lacking ambition, even though he was still in grad school. My family had a gift for reducing people to their resume, stripping away their humanity until all that was left was a ledger of what they could or couldn't provide. So when I introduced my partner to them, I should have known what was coming. I should have prepared myself for the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the judgment, but I wasn't ready for the cruelty. I wasn't ready for how easily they dismissed the man I loved, how quickly they labeled him, how eagerly they mocked him as though it were a sport. The first time I brought him to a family dinner, I felt the shift in the air before we even sat down. My aunt's eyes swept over his plain jacket, and she smirked. My uncle, who had always bragged about his investments, asked my partner about his job in a tone so condescending it was practically a sneer. "Hardware store manager?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's quaint." The table erupted in soft chuckles, and my cheeks burned. It only got worse from there. They mocked his car, his clothes, his lack of ambition. My cousin leaned across the table and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Are you sure he's not just with you because he needs someone to support him?" The word they kept circling back to, like vultures when they tried to humiliate him. It enraged me, but it also humbled me. How could he stay so steady while I sat there, shaking with anger and shame? How could he endure their mockery with dignity when they had stripped me raw with their words? As the night wore on, their cruelty only grew bolder. My mother, who had always prided herself on her tact, leaned in close to me and said in a whisper sharp enough to cut, "You could do better. Why settle for someone so ordinary?" I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood, because I wanted to scream back, "Ordinary? He's more extraordinary than any of you." But I didn't. I swallowed the words, the pain, the fury. What they didn't understand, what they refused to see, was that he wasn't with me for my family's approval. He wasn't with me for money, status, or recognition. He was with me because he loved me. And wasn't that supposed to be enough? But in my family, love was never enough. That night, I sat there caught between two worlds, one filled with the man who made me feel whole, and another filled with people who had raised me but now seemed like strangers. I wanted to believe I could have both, that love and loyalty could coexist. But as their laughter echoed around me, something inside me broke. Because for the first time I realized my family didn't want what was best for me. They wanted what was best for their image. I glanced at him across the table. He caught my eye, gave me the smallest of smiles, steady, reassuring, a silent reminder that we were in this together. That smile was my anchor. But the sting of my family's words still dug into my skin like barbed wire. After dessert, when most of the guests were distracted, my brother leaned in and muttered under his breath, "Don't be blind. Guys like him drag you down. He's a loser. You'll regret this." That word again, loser. But this time, it didn't just cut, it ignited something inside me. A fire, slow but steady, fueled by rage and heartbreak. Because I knew they were wrong, I knew it in my bones. But what hurt most was knowing they would never admit it, not until they were forced to. And that night, as I lay in bed replaying every cruel remark, every mocking laugh, deceptively normal, it was one of those grand dinners my family adored, hosted at my uncle's sprawling suburban home where the chandeliers always seemed to sparkle a little too brightly, as if to remind everyone that they had made it. The table stretched endlessly, covered in crystal glasses and plates rimmed with gold. It was a performance, not a meal. And like every performance, there had to be a scapegoat. That night, the scapegoat was the man I loved. It began with small digs, subtle at first, almost disguised as banter. My cousin asked him how his little store was doing, as though running a business, even a modest one, was laughable. My aunt leaned over and asked if he'd ever thought about finding a real career. The chuckles that followed were not quiet. They were loud enough to echo, loud enough to sting. I sat there, trying to keep my composure, my nails digging crescents into my palms under the tablecloth. I wanted to tell them to stop. I wanted to scream that they had no right to belittle the man who treated me with more kindness and respect than all of them combined. But the words tangled in my throat, strangled by the old, familiar fear of turning against my family. Then came the moment that burned itself into my memory. My uncle raised his glass, smiling with the kind of smugness that always preceded cruelty. "You know," he said loudly, "it's a miracle you managed to land someone like her. Most men in your situation would still be alone." The room erupted in laughter. Real laughter, sharp, cruel, echoing against the polished walls. Even people who should have known better, cousins who weren't normally cruel, chuckled along because that's what you did in my family. You laughed at the weak to stay in the good graces of the strong. I froze. My face burned. My chest tightened. And shame washed over me in a tidal wave. They weren't just mocking him. They were mocking me, my choice, my love, my life. Every laugh felt like a dagger. And yet, when I looked at him, he wasn't crumbling. He wasn't shrinking back or lashing out. He was calm. He sat there with a faint, almost amused smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as though their cruelty couldn't touch him. That smile confused me, but in that moment it also enraged me. How could he sit there so composed while I was drowning in
All your money, your smug little... At least he knows how to treat people with respect. At least he has integrity. What do you have? Fancy plates and cruel tongues. The silence that followed was suffocating. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears, but I refused to look away. I locked eyes with each of them, daring them to speak, daring them to laugh again. No one did. Finally, my mother cleared her throat, her voice icy. "You're embarrassing yourself." "No," I shot back, my voice breaking with emotion. "I'm embarrassing you. Because for once, someone is standing up to you." The air was thick, heavy. Every breath in the room sharp enough to cut. And in that silence, I felt years of suppressed anger pour out of me. Every time they mocked someone for being different. Every time they measured love against wealth. Every time they made me doubt myself. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. It was about finally saying what should have been said years ago. And yet, even in that storm of anger, my heart was breaking. Because deep down, I knew there was no going back. That outburst had drawn a line in the sand. I had chosen him, and in choosing him, I had turned my back on them. I sat back down, trembling, tears pricking my eyes. My hands shook as I reached for my glass again. But before I could lift it, I felt his hand slide over mine under the table. Warm, steady, grounding. I turned to look at him, and there it was again, that strange, knowing smile. While I was unraveling, he was composed. While I was bleeding, he was calm. His thumb brushed over my knuckles gently, and he leaned in close. So close I could feel the heat of his breath against my ear. He held my hand under the and whispered words that made my heart stop. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the loudest warning sign you'll ever miss. After that dinner, after my outburst and his strangely calm reaction, something inside me shifted. I had defended him with every ounce of fire I had left, but his composure unsettled me. It was almost as if he had expected it all. The cruelty, the humiliation, even my explosion. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't shaken. He was prepared. And when I replayed,
he'd say, smiling proudly as if my successes were enough for both of us. It seemed sweet at the time, selfless even, but now it struck me differently. He never spent lavishly, but he was never desperate either. He drove that old, dented car that rattled on every turn, yet his bills were always paid. He wore the same rotation of worn jackets and shirts, yet somehow, We never struggled when rent was due or when emergencies popped up. Once, my tyre blew out on the highway, and before I could even panic, he had it replaced. Paid in cash, no questions asked. I used to think he was just careful with money, the kind of man who didn't need material things to be content. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised careful men don't make unexplained late-night phone calls. Yes, the calls. They had always been a quiet mystery, tucked into the background of our lives. Every few weeks, sometimes in the middle of the night, his phone would buzz. He'd glance at the screen, his face unreadable, then step outside to take the call. When he came back, he'd smile faintly, kiss my forehead and say, "Just work stuff. Go back to sleep." And I always did. There were the sudden trips, too. Short, unplanned absences where he'd say, "I need to handle something. I'll be back tomorrow." No explanation, no details. Just gone. And every time he came back, he carried no souvenirs, no stories, no signs that he had been anywhere at all, except for that same faint, knowing smile. At first, I convinced myself it was harmless. Some men are just private, I told myself. Some men don't feel the need to share every detail. But after years of watching my family mock him, after years of defending him, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely wrong. Maybe he was hiding something. Maybe he wasn't the open book I wanted him to be. And yet, the contradiction gnawed at me, because despite his secrecy, I never once felt unsafe with him. He was steady, grounding, loyal in ways that mattered. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't flirt with anyone else.
Because I didn't know how to defend him anymore without sounding naive. Loyalty kept me silent, but doubt kept me awake. I remember one night lying beside him, staring at the ceiling while he slept. His breathing was steady, peaceful, as though the world had never touched him. I wanted to shake him awake and scream, "Tell me who you really are. Tell me why you hide. Tell me why you don't let me in." But I didn't. I turned on my side, pressed my face into his shoulder, and let the silence swallow me whole. The suspense built like a drumbeat in my chest. Who was this man I loved so fiercely? Why did he carry himself with such quiet confidence when everyone else saw him as nothing? And why did I sometimes catch that glimmer in his eyes, as if he was watching a play unfold that only he knew the ending to? The answer came on a night I wasn't looking for it. It was late. He had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day. I couldn't sleep, my mind spinning with doubts and memories. I wandered into the study, intending only to grab a book to distract myself. But then I saw it. That drawer. The one he always kept locked. Tonight, it wasn't. I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hands shook as I reached for the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. Inside, neatly organized, were papers, documents, things I had never seen before. And in the middle of it all, something that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just papers. It wasn't just numbers. It wasn't just letters. It was something that didn't belong in the life of a man everyone called a failure. And then, late one night, I found something in his drawer that changed everything I thought I knew about him. Sometimes the answers we spend years avoiding don't whisper when they finally arrive. They scream. My hand trembled as I pulled the drawer open wider. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and my chest. I hadn't meant to find anything. I hadn't gone searching like some suspicious partner trying to catch a man in a lie. But there it was, plain as day, stacked neatly and deliberately, as though waiting for me all along. The first thing fantasy, then reality. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, certain I was misreading them. But they didn't change. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. How could the man everyone, including me, believed to be barely scraping by have access to this kind of wealth? My family's taunts about him being a loser, their jeers about him being a burden? Had it all been wrong? Or was this worse? My heart pounded so hard it hurt, because as much as I wanted to believe this was good, that he wasn't a failure at all, that maybe he was quietly successful, another darker possibility twisted in my mind. What if he wasn't who I thought he was at all? What if the money wasn't clean? What if it was tied to something dangerous, illegal? No man hides fortune like this unless he has a reason. No man plays poor while sitting on millions unless he has something to lose. I stumbled back, dropping the papers onto the desk, my mind spinning. Loyalty and doubt waged war inside me. Part of me wanted to run into our bedroom, wake him up, shove the files in his face, and demand answers. But another part of me hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation? What if confronting him broke something fragile we had been building for years? The weight of secrets pressed down on me. I thought back to all the moments I had ignored. The late-night phone calls, the sudden trips, the vague answers. I thought back to his calm at every family insult, as though he were watching a game only he understood. The puzzle pieces clicked together, forming an outline of a truth I couldn't yet name. Fear gnawed at me, because for the first time, I wasn't just worried about what my family thought. I was worried about who I had let into my life. I sat on the edge of the couch with the papers spread across my lap, staring at numbers I couldn't comprehend. Millions. Tens of millions. Accounts spread across countries. Investments tied to companies I'd only heard about on the news. He wasn't just comfortable. He was wealthy beyond anything I had ever imagined. And the question that clawed at me was simple and terrifying. Why hide it? If he loved me, why let me struggle alongside him, counting pennies while he drove that battered old car? Why let my family humiliate him when he had the power to silence them with a single bank statement? Why live like a coffee cup? My heart screamed to ask, to demand, to rip the mask away. And yet, when I opened my mouth, the words caught again. Instead, I asked the safest question I could muster. Where did you go last night when your phone rang? He paused only for a second, then smiled faintly. Work stuff. Don't worry about it. But I couldn't help it anymore. I was worried. The smile that once comforted me now looked like armor. The vagueness that once seemed like humility now felt like deception. Every detail I once loved about his simplicity now felt like a veil hiding something too big to understand. For days, I carried the weight alone, replaying the numbers in my mind. Sometimes I convinced myself he was a secret genius investor, someone too modest to admit success. Other times I convinced myself he was laundering money for someone dangerous, that the calm in his eyes was really the calm of a man walking a tightrope with no net. The suspense consumed me until I could barely breathe. Finally, one night, I broke. I couldn't live in the silence anymore. I waited until he was sitting at his desk, reading one of those endless reports he always seemed to have. My heart pounded as I walked toward him, clutching one of the bank statements I had taken from the drawer. My hands shook so badly the paper rattled. I need to know, I said, my voice trembling. What is this? Who are you, really? For the first time, he looked startled. His eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me. And then, slowly, that same faint smile curved his lips. Where did you find that? He asked softly. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It doesn't matter where. What matters is what it means. Why do you have this? Why didn't you tell me? What are you hiding from me? He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and regarded me with a look I couldn't read. Not anger, not guilt. Something else entirely. And then he spoke. When I asked him about it, his answer left me more confused than before. The more I thought I knew him, the more he showed me just enough to remind me I didn't know him at all. After confronting him with the papers I had found, I expected anger. I expected defensiveness, denial. Calls before? He would step outside to take them. His voice low, his expression unreadable. But now, he took some of them in front of me. The words weren't in English. Sometimes French, sometimes German, once even Mandarin. His tone was confident, commanding, far from the soft-spoken man my family ridiculed. I didn't understand the languages, but I understood authority when I heard it. Whoever he was talking to, They weren't dismissing him as a loser. They were listening. Closely. Then came the meetings. He began inviting me along on errands that didn't look like errands at all. Instead of the hardware store or the grocery shop, we drove to hotels with glass facades and marble lobbies, where men in tailored suits greeted him with handshakes full of respect. They looked at him the way my family looked at doctors, lawyers, CEOs, like he mattered. They offered him cigars, poured him whiskey, pulled him aside for hushed conversations that lasted an hour while I sat in the lobby, staring at my reflection in gold-framed mirrors, wondering who exactly I was dating. When he returned, he always looked the same, calm, collected, as if nothing unusual had happened. Just business, he'd say with that faint smile. But business for a loser didn't look like this. The contradictions tore at me. On one hand, he was still the man who fixed squeaky cabinet doors in our apartment with his bare hands, who picked daisies from the roadside and tucked them behind my ear. On the other hand, he was shaking hands with men who wore Rolexes and spoke in currencies my family only dreamed about. And through it all, my family's voices echoed in my head like a cruel chorus. He's nothing. He's using you. He'll never amount to anything. Their words clashed with what I saw, creating a storm inside me that left me dizzy. Love battled doubt. Loyalty fought with suspicion. Every time he kissed me, I felt safe. Every time he disappeared into a private meeting, I felt like I was drowning. One night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. We were sitting in the car outside our building, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. I turned to him, my voice sharper than I intended. Who are you? Really? Because my family thinks you're a nobody. And sometimes, because every time doubt tried to consume me, he would do something that reminded me why I loved him. Like the night I came home from work, exhausted and ready to collapse, and found dinner already on the table, candles flickering, my favorite song playing softly in the background. He held me close and whispered, "You don't have to carry everything alone." And in that moment, I didn't care about bank statements or strange phone calls. I cared about us. But the suspense never let go. It was always there, lurking in the shadows of our life together, whispering questions I didn't want to ask. Was I in too deep? Was I falling in love with a stranger? Was I blind to a truth that would shatter me? The turning point came unexpectedly. It wasn't during a phone call or a business meeting. It was on a quiet Sunday morning when I least expected it. He was making coffee, humming to himself, when he turned to me suddenly. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made me freeze. "I want you to come with me," he said. "To where?" I asked, half laughing, half nervous. "You'll see." I pressed him for details, but he gave none. Just that same faint smile, that same calm confidence that both infuriated and reassured me. And though I hesitated, though my heart pounded with both fear and excitement, I agreed, because deep down I knew, whatever he was hiding, this invitation was the doorway. And then one day, he invited me somewhere that shattered the illusion once and for all. The first time I watched a room bend toward him, I realized I had never really seen him at all. He told me to dress nice but comfortable, which sounded like a riddle and felt like a test. I stood in front of my closet longer than I care to admit, fingers moving past the safe choices my family would have approved of, the stiff dresses that screamed pedigree, and the heels that announced wealth before I said a word. I chose a simple black midi dress that moved when I walked, a pair of heels that wouldn't punish me for the sin of standing, a soft cream trench that made me feel like myself. He met me at the door as the sun slid down the skyline, paused, and smiled in that quiet way of his that said everything and nothing at once. We didn't take his car. That alone unsettled me. Instead, a sedan waited at the curb, not the flashy kind that makes people stare, but the subtle kind that people and thought about the first time my family called him a loser. They had said the word casually, like it was a fact that required no evidence. I had swallowed my anger, kept my head down, and tried to forget it. But now, as the car turned onto a quiet street lined with trees trimmed like sculpture, and townhouses that seemed to inhale and exhale money, I realized how blind that word had been, and how dangerous my silence had felt in comparison. The car stopped in front of a townhouse so elegant it seemed almost shy about it. There was no ostentatious signage, no velvet rope,
no line of people trying to prove they belonged. A discreet brass plaque beside the door gave away nothing. The driver pressed a buzzer. A camera above the door shifted with a barely audible click. A beat, then the door opened. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped out and said my partner's name again. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of deference that suggested titles didn't matter because the person in front of him transcended them. Inside, the entryway was quiet the way expensive places are quiet. The hush you get when nothing is out of place and everything has been curated to soften edges and slow heartbeats. The air smelled faintly of cedar and citrus. The lighting was warm and indirect, as if the building itself had learned the flattering art of never showing too much at once. We were led down a hallway hung with art so subtle I couldn't tell whether the frames were there to display paintings or to suggest the possibility of them. In the dining room, a long table of dark wood gleamed like a lake at midnight. At one end sat a woman with silver hair cut into a precise bob and a silk scarf draped just so. At the other, a man in his 60s with a face that had learned how to look kind without looking weak. Between them, empty places set with crystal that chimed when the server poured water. My partner's hand rested lightly at the small of my back as the host guided us to seats near the middle. The room adjusted around him, the way people adjust when someone they trust arrives. Small movements, not deference exactly, but something like gravitational pull. "Finally," the silver-haired woman said, standing. She kissed my partner on both cheeks, European style, then turned to me with a smile that felt like being invited into a secret. "You must be the woman who makes him unreachable on
Small talk. It never is in rooms like that. They didn't ask where I worked or who my family knew. They asked what I read when I couldn't sleep, which corner of the city felt like home, what the first big decision of my life had taught me. They listened to my answers with a kind of concentrated curiosity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't at my own family's table in years. But their attention sharpened when they turned to him. "How did the Zurich call end?" the silver-haired woman asked, almost casually. "Better than expected," he said, unfolding his napkin. "They were never going to move without someone else stepping first. Now they will." "So you'll fill the gap?" the man at the head asked. "If it keeps the timeline intact." No one questioned whether he could. They only discussed whether he should. Terms floated across the table like chess pieces. Currency hedges, regulatory approvals, convertible notes, leadership transitions, post-merger integration, not as buzzwords, but as decisions already in motion. He spoke without notes, without bravado, mapping possibilities with the unhurried cadence of someone who understood that time bends around people who know what they're doing. I studied him while they spoke. The way he held his fork, balanced between thought and action. The way he nodded when the older man pushed back on a point. Not defensive, not eager to win. Interested, as if the discussion itself was the victory. The way he paused before answering, letting silence do some of the work. It didn't match the man who fixed humming fridge motors and laughed at his own bad puns. And yet it did. The same patience, the same steadiness, the same refusal to perform. "Are you sure about the governance?" the woman asked. "You know how quickly admiration turns into interference." "I'm sure," he said. And when he smiled, I saw that mysterious calm again. "If it does, I'll step away." "You always say that," she countered, like someone who had watched him make impossible choices look effortless, and somehow you never have to. Dinner arrived in quiet courses that felt less like consumption and more like choreography. Not because it was fussy, but because everything had been arranged to encourage conversation to keep moving. Between bites, they folded me in. Stories about losing a deal that turned out to be the luckiest thing that ever happened. Context. Not a ledger, not an origin myth, but a living map of how rooms bent when he walked in. After coffee, the older man stood. "Give me 2 minutes," he said to my partner. "I want to show you something upstairs." He nodded to me as if to say, "I'll bring him back intact." The woman took my hand and led me toward a sitting room with low sofas and a wall of books that had clearly been read. "He's different with you," she said once we were seated, not unkindly. "Quieter, in a way that means calmer, not closed. That's rare for him.
What is he to you? I asked, careful and curious at once. A catalyst, she said. A compass, when the room has too many magnets. And a reminder that money is a terrible reason to say yes and an even worse reason to say no. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Who my partner was to the world, why the city's quiet corridors seemed to know his name, how long he had been living this double exposure of hardware store manager by day and conductor of strange, large things by night. Instead, I asked the smallest, truest question I could manage. Why doesn't he tell me? She considered me for a moment. Because he's learned that people love versions of him that don't exist. He's learned to keep the real one safe until someone loves him for the small things. The broken dishwasher he fixes, the way he shows up on a Tuesday. Has he told you less than you need? Yes. Has he lied? No. The answer settled over me like a blanket that didn't quite reach my feet. It warmed, but it didn't cover everything. I thought of my family's laughter, the word loser hanging in the air like smoke, and I felt the whiplash of living between their shallow certainty and this room's quiet respect. I loved him. That part had never been in question. But love doesn't erase disorientation. It only asks you to walk through it. They returned a few minutes later. My partner's expression was unchanged, but the older man's carried the satisfaction of someone who had planted a flag in a contested land. As we stood to go, the woman pressed a card into my hand. Nothing printed on it but a phone number. For when you need a second pair of eyes, she said. And I understood it wasn't an Now, sleeves pushed back, wrist bare of anything that declared itself expensive. Gaze steady, as if the night had not shifted the axis of our small world. You didn't have to bring me there, I said finally. I did, he replied, turning to face. You asked who I am. I thought you should see the shape of it, not the resume. So, who are you? I asked. Not teasing, not accusing, pleading. His smile was soft enough to break a heart. Someone who learned the hard way that the loudest rooms aren't always the most important one. He paused. Someone who tries to build quiet things that last. It wasn't a title. It wasn't a confession. But it wasn't nothing either. It was a doorway he had opened just wide enough for me to put my foot inside. The car eased to a stop in front of our building. The driver stepped out to open my door. My partner thanked him by name again, and the driver's yes sir held something like loyalty in it. We climbed the stairs to our apartment, and for a moment everything felt almost normal. The click of the lock, the soft thud of my heels on the rug, the familiar shape of our small life waiting for us in the dark. I leaned against the counter and watched him loosen his collar, as if he had simply come back from running an errand. The ordinariness of the gesture made me ache with something like relief and something like fear. I had been given a glimpse, not a revelation. The window had opened, then closed. My family's voices returned in the vacuum, cruel and wrong, and yet they still lived in me, like ghosts that refused to leave even after you proved the house wasn't theirs. Is there more? I asked quietly. More I should see? There always is, he said, but one glimpse at a time. He crossed the room, took my face in his hands and kissed my forehead. You looked beautiful tonight. I wanted to tell him that beauty felt irrelevant in rooms where power ran under the floorboards like electricity. I wanted to tell him that I was proud and scared in equal measure. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the steadiness of his palms quiet the tremor in my chest. That words, not even in another dinner, but in an invitation that made my breath catch in my throat the moment I read it. But what I saw next made me realize I was dating a man they couldn't even imagine. The night he finally told me the truth, I realized the man I loved wasn't hiding failure. He was hiding everything my family worshipped. The night was ordinary in every way that mattered. We had take-out boxes spread across the coffee table, a bottle of cheap red wine open between us, and the soft hum of the city bleeding in through the cracked window. He was still in his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, hair tousled like he had run his fingers through it too many times. I had kicked off my heels hours ago, My feet curled beneath me on the couch, balancing noodles precariously on a flimsy plastic fork. It should have been another quiet evening in our small apartment. It should have been nothing. But instead, it became everything. I had been carrying questions since the night of that dinner. Questions that burned hotter every day I kept them locked inside. The glimpse I had gotten, the reverence in that elegant townhouse, the way people far more powerful than my family spoke to him, it didn't match the story I had been told all my life. My family's voice still rang in my head, mocking him, reducing him to nothing more than a loser with old shoes and an older car. But I couldn't reconcile that cruel caricature with the man I had seen in that room, the one who spoke with quiet authority, who made others listen like their futures depended on his words. I set down my fork and finally asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked up from his carton, startled but not defensive. For a moment, he studied me as though weighing how much truth I was ready to carry. Then he set his food aside, leaned back, and exhaled. Because the moment I tell people, I stop being a man and I start being a number. The words landed heavy in the room. My mind replayed the countless moments I had seen him brushed aside, ignored, even humiliated, and how easily those same people would have bent over backwards if they had known what he really carried. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, his eyes distant but steady. You don't know how many times I've seen it happen. The second and all along he had been carrying the very thing they worshipped most. Not just money, but power, respect, the kind of influence they would have trampled each other to get close to. I wanted to know, I whispered, my voice cracking. I wanted to understand you. He leaned forward, his voice softer now. And you do. You understood me before you knew any of this. That's why I didn't tell you right away. Because for the first time, someone loved me for me, not for what I had. The words should have soothed me, and in many ways they did. But a part of me still ached. But why didn't you trust me? Didn't you think I was strong enough to handle it? He sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from years of carrying a weight no one else can see. It wasn't about you. It was about me. I've been burned before. People I thought were friends, people I thought cared. Every time the money was what they saw. Every time it became the only thing they wanted. I couldn't let that happen again. Not with you. His honesty cut deeper than any lie could have. I felt both pride and pain crash into me at once. Pride that he had chosen me not for my background, not for my family name, not for the shallow markers my relatives obsessed over. Pain that he hadn't trusted me sooner. That he had carried this secret in silence while I stumbled in the dark, questioning myself, doubting us. I reached across the table, placed my hand on his, and felt the steadiness in his grip. I loved you when you were just the man with the old car and the quiet smile. I loved you when my family called you a loser. I loved you before I had any idea who you really were. That doesn't change now. His eyes softened, and for a moment the calm that always seemed to surround him broke just enough for me to glimpse the vulnerability beneath. That's what I needed to know, he said quietly. The rest of the night passed in fragments. He told me little pieces of his truth, not the full story yet, but enough to stitch together the outline. Investments that had grown bigger than he ever expected. Partnerships forged in silence because he hated the circus of publicity. A company that bore no trace of his name but depended on his vision. And always, the moment they saw the truth, they would turn on a dime. From mockery to admiration, from disdain to desperate approval. And in that shift, I would see just how hollow their loyalty truly was. As he cleared the table that night, humming under his breath like nothing had changed, I realized something had. Not just between us, but in me. I loved him. Not the bank statements, not the influence, not the hidden empire. But knowing the truth meant I would never look at my family the same way again. Their cruelty, their elitism, their smug superiority, it had all been exposed as empty, because the man they mocked was everything they claimed to value, and more. But I didn't tell them, not yet. Some part of me wanted to protect him a little longer, to hold this truth close like a fragile flame. I wasn't ready to watch my family's hypocrisy unfold. I wasn't ready to see their faces when they realized they had been bowing to the wrong gods all along. Still, fate doesn't wait for readiness. Because just when I thought we had time, just when I thought I could keep his secret safe a little longer, the world conspired to reveal it for us. And the people who had once laughed in his face were about to choke on their own words. And little did I know that revelation was about to happen sooner than I thought. You can prepare for a storm, but when it finally breaks, it never feels the way you imagined. When the invitation arrived, my stomach sank before I even opened it. It was another family dinner. Another evening in which my relatives would polish their silverware, sharpen their smiles, and prepare to slice him apart with words that stung sharper than knives. I held the envelope in my hand like it was a summons to war, and in many ways it was. I dreaded telling him, but when I did, he didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even sigh. He simply smiled that calm, unreadable smile of his and said, "We're going." I stared at him, incredulous. Why? Why put yourself through that again? Why let them treat you like— "Because sometimes," he interrupted gently, "the best way to end a story is to let it play itself out." I didn't know what he meant, but I saw in his eyes that same
dining table and glasses of wine sparkled in manicured hands. My family was in their element, polished, loud, self-satisfied. The moment we walked in, I felt the air shift, that ripple of disdain they never bothered to hide. "Oh, you brought him again," my aunt said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How brave of you." My cousin smirked. "Still driving that old tin can? I heard they don't even make parts for it anymore." Laughter rippled around the table. I clenched my fists so tightly, my nails dug crescents into my palms. But before I could snap back, his hand brushed against mine under the table. A gentle squeeze. A signal. Wait. Dinner unfolded like every other nightmare I had endured at their hands. My uncle asked him condescending questions about how business was going, in the tone of someone humoring a child. My brother made loud jokes about how I could have done better. My mother, with her trademark icy disapproval, asked if I was still happy with this arrangement, as though my love life were a bad lease. Every word was a knife. Every laugh was a twist. And through it all he sat there, calm, composed, even faintly amused, as if watching a play he had already memorized. I burned with shame and fury. How could they? How could they treat the man I loved as if he were beneath them, as if he weren't worth the dirt on their shoes? And how could he just sit there, letting it wash over him like rain that didn't matter? But every time I opened my mouth to lash out, his hand found mine again. Another squeeze, another signal. Not yet. The tension built until I thought I would explode. My family grew bolder with each glass of wine, their insults more pointed, their laughter more cruel. They believed, as they always had, that they were untouchable, that their money and status gave them the right to look down on him. Finally, after my uncle delivered yet another cutting remark, something about how it must be hard living off scraps, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to defend him, to unleash every truth I had bottled up. But before I could speak, he moved. He set his fork down with deliberate care. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, waiting for the punchline. But there was no punchline. He stood with the same composure he always carried, not rushing, not posturing, not feeding off the anticipation. He simply existed, steady and grounded, as if he had known this moment was inevitable. His hand rested lightly on the back of his chair, and when he began to speak, his voice wasn't raised. It was calm, almost conversational, but every syllable carried weight. "I've listened to your questions," he said evenly, his eyes sweeping the table. "I've endured your jokes. I've sat here quietly while you measured me against your yardstick of success. Tonight, maybe it's time I answer you." A murmur shifted across the table, a mix of curiosity and discomfort. My uncle leaned back in his chair, smirking as though expecting some flimsy defense. My cousin raised an eyebrow. My mother's lips pressed into a thin, white line. He continued,
Yes, I drive an old car. Yes, I live simply. Yes, I don't parade my life in front of others. And you know why? Because I've seen how people treat men with wealth. I've seen how quickly admiration turns to greed, how kindness is replaced with calculation. I've seen rooms like this one, where respect is conditional and cruelty is currency. Silence deepened, thick and heavy. No one laughed now. He straightened slightly, his calm presence filling the space with something larger than himself. But since you seem so interested, let me be clear. I am not broke. I am not failing. I am not the man you've painted me to be. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like thunderclouds. I own multiple businesses. I've invested in companies you admire but don't realize I helped build. I sit on boards you wouldn't be invited to enter the lobby of. And if I wanted, I could buy and sell half the things you boast about. Gasps broke around the table. My cousin's smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. My uncle's jaw slackened. My aunt's wineglass trembled so violently she had to set it down before spilling it. Even my mother, always composed, paled, her eyes flickering with the realization that the man she had dismissed so easily was nothing like she thought. I sat frozen, my heart pounding.
Finally, my uncle cleared his throat, attempting bravado. If that's true, why hide it? Why live like this? He turned his gaze toward my uncle, not unkind but unflinching. Because living simply keeps me honest. Because the people worth keeping close don't care about numbers. Because wealth doesn't define me, but it seems to define all of you. The words landed like a strike to the chest. My family squirmed, suddenly exposed, their obsession with appearances turned against them. I felt my throat tighten, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Not because I was ashamed of him, but because I was so proud. Proud that he had finally spoken the truth. Proud that he had done it with grace when he had every right to unleash anger. Proud that I had loved him for the man he was, not the fortune he carried. Around the table, shame rippled through faces that had never known how to wear it. My cousin stared down at his plate. My aunt fidgeted with her napkin. My brother cleared his throat but said nothing. The mighty had been silenced, not with force but with truth. And still he wasn't finished. He let the silence linger, then leaned forward slightly, his gaze sweeping across every single one of them. You've mocked me. You've mocked her for loving me. You've called me a loser, a burden, a mistake. And all the while you never thought to ask who I really was. You were too busy laughing to see the truth standing right in front of you. The words sliced through the air like glass shattering. No one dared to speak. I reached for his hand under the table, my heart swelling with both love and relief. For years I had begged my family to see him, to value him, to understand why I loved him. Now they were confronted with the truth they couldn't ignore, and for once I didn't have to defend him. He was defending himself, and in doing so, he was defending me too. The silence stretched on, filled with nothing but the sound of heavy breaths and the occasional clink of a glass being set down too quickly. My family looked like statues carved from guilt and disbelief. And then, just when I thought it was over, he spoke again. But what he said next turned the knife even deeper. When truth rips the mask away, the faces that remain aren't always what you expect. Don't take it so seriously. Her attempt at recovery was pathetic. The same woman who had rolled her eyes at him, who had sneered at his clothes, was now trying to paint cruelty as humor. Her cheeks flushed, as though even she didn't quite believe the words leaving her mouth. My cousin followed, stumbling over his own excuses. I mean, we didn't really think you were a loser, he said, tugging at his collar. We just didn't know the full story. His voice cracked, his confidence gone. He sounded less like the smug boy who had once mocked my partner's car, and more like a child caught stealing cookies. But not everyone scrambled to apologize. My uncle leaned back in his chair, his face twisted into something between bitterness and disbelief. So what? He snapped. You've got money. Congratulations. That doesn't change the fact that you've been deceiving us all along, living like some pauper, letting us think you were beneath us. What kind of game is that? The bitterness in his tone stung, but my partner didn't flinch. He met my uncle's glare with calm composure. It's not a game.
It's a choice. I don't measure myself by your standards, and if you feel deceived, that says more about you than it does about me." The words were sharp, but not cruel, spoken with a dignity that made my uncle shrink in his chair despite himself. It was the kind of dignity my family had never managed to grasp, the kind that comes from knowing your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition. My mother sat stiffly, her face pale, her lips trembling as though words hovered but refused to escape. She had always prided herself on control, on icy composure, but tonight even she was cracking. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. "Why didn't you tell us?" He turned to her gently, not unkindly. "Would you have listened if I had? Or would you have laughed, the way you always did?" The question cut deep. I saw it in her eyes, the flicker of shame she couldn't hide. For once, she had no rebuttal. I sat there watching it all unfold, my emotions a storm I couldn't name. Pride swelled in me like a tide, fierce and unrelenting. He had faced them all and stood unshaken, while I had spent years shrinking under their judgment. Anger burned hot too, directed at every laugh, every insult, every moment they had tried.
That's the difference between us. For me, the point isn't flaunting. The point is freedom. The table fell quiet again. Some avoided his gaze, some stared, some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And I realized then that what I was witnessing wasn't just shock, it was shame. The shame of realizing they had judged a man not because of who he was, but because of who they assumed he wasn't. The shame of recognizing that their values, shallow, elitist, cruel, had blinded them to truth. But the shame wasn't enough for everyone. My uncle, still seething, muttered, "Money doesn't make you better than us." "No," my partner agreed evenly, "it doesn't. But kindness does. Integrity does. And those are things you can't buy." The words landed like a verdict. I felt my chest swell with pride, tears stinging my eyes. For years I had wanted to defend him like this, but my voice had always faltered. Tonight he had spoken for himself and for me. My aunt dabbed her eyes with her napkin, suddenly desperate to rewrite the narrative. "We didn't mean to be cruel," she insisted. "We just didn't understand." But the truth was they had meant it. Every joke, every sneer, every whispered insult, they had meant it. And now they were scrambling not out of guilt, but out of fear. Fear of losing access to the very man they had mocked. That realization hurt more than any insult ever had, because it meant their apologies weren't born of change, but of self-interest. And deep down, I knew it. I looked around the table at the faces of people I had once trusted, once loved without question, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Could I ever forgive them? Could I ever see them the same way again? The answer trembled inside me. No. I turned to my partner, his hand steady in mine, and felt the anchor of his presence calm my storm. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't humiliated them. He had spoken truth with grace, and in that grace, he had shown them everything they lacked. But just as I thought the night had reached its breaking point, my father, who had been silent all evening, finally spoke. His voice was he said, his voice low but strong enough that everyone heard. "It was never about the money. Not for me, and not for you." The words struck me harder than any confession of wealth could have. In that single moment, I realized the unspoken truth. I had already passed the test. Without even knowing it, I had loved him when everyone else mocked him, stood by him when he looked like he had nothing, chosen him when it cost me the respect of my own blood. And he knew it. My chest tightened, tears threatening to fall, because for so long I had doubted myself. I had wondered if maybe I was blind, naive, foolish for believing in him against the chorus of my family's judgment. But now, with those words, he told me what I needed most, that my love had been real, untainted by greed, untouched by appearances. I squeezed his hand, whispering back, "It never mattered. Not to me." For a moment it felt like the world stilled.
as if the chaos around us had no power here, as if our love existed in a space they could never touch. I saw pride in his eyes, not the arrogant kind my family wore like armor, but the quiet pride of a man who had finally been seen. But the peace didn't last, because as quickly as the shock had silenced them, my family began to recover. And with recovery came calculation. I saw it in their faces, the way their eyes darted between him and each other, the way their postures shifted. My aunt, who minutes earlier had sneered at him, now leaned forward with forced warmth. "We just didn't realize what you'd accomplished," she said, her voice syrupy. "It's admirable, really." "You're admirable," my cousin chimed in, suddenly eager. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but we have some business ideas we've been tossing around. Maybe you'd be interested." He cut him off with a single glance, calm but firm. "This isn't a business meeting." The rebuke landed with weight, shutting my cousin down instantly. But the shift had already begun. They weren't mocking him anymore. They weren't dismissing him. Now they were circling, like vultures who had smelled a different kind of opportunity. Pride for him swelled in me again, but so did anger, because I saw their hypocrisy laid bare, how easily their disdain turned to exploit him, to bind him with the same shallow ties they had tried to bind me. Would they pretend to respect him while plotting to use him? The thought twisted my stomach. He must have seen the worry on my face, because he leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let them in. You and me, that's what matters. Nothing else." But as much as I wanted to believe it was that simple, I knew my family too well. They wouldn't give up easily. They had spent years mocking him for being beneath them. Now that they realized he stood above them, they would try to climb, claw, and manipulate their way back into favor. The dinner dragged on, though the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Gone was the mocking laughter, replaced with uneasy small talk and forced politeness. Gone were the cruel jokes, replaced with awkward compliments that rang hollow. He remained composed, dignified, never once letting them dictate the tone again. And though I was proud beyond words, I was also terrified of what came next. Because wealth didn't just change perception, it changed intentions. And my family's intentions were rarely pure. Just as I thought the night was winding down, he set his glass down with deliberate care. The sound echoed, silencing the murmurs. He looked around the table, his gaze steady, his voice calm. "I don't expect you to like me. I don't even expect you to respect me. But if you want to be part of her life, our life, then there's something you need to understand." I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The room leaned in, waiting. But he had one condition that would change everything for them. Respect isn't requested. It's commanded. And that night, my partner made it clear, you either honor us or you lose us. The clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs still hung in the air when he leaned forward, his posture straight, his eyes steady, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the most arrogant relative freeze in place. The calmness in his tone was scarier than any outburst could have been. "Let's make something clear," he said. "From this moment forward, respect is the only currency I'll accept in this family. If you cannot offer it, then you will not have access to either of us. Not to me, not to her, not to the life we are building." Father, who had always believed his voice was the final authority, pressed his lips together so tightly they turned white. For the first time in my life, I saw my family powerless. And it wasn't because of his money, not really. It was because he had exposed the rot of their hypocrisy, stripped them of the armor they had worn for so long. He wasn't the loser they had mocked. He was the man they couldn't control. I felt something inside me shift, something I hadn't realized I'd been craving my entire life. Power. Not the kind that comes from wealth or status, but the kind that comes from standing firm, from refusing to bow to cruelty, from watching those who had hurt you shrink under the weight of their own shame. For the first time, I wasn't the embarrassed daughter or the apologetic girlfriend. I was a woman standing beside a man who refused to let me be diminished. My heart swelled with pride, so much it almost hurt. I reached for his hand beneath the table, not out of desperation, but solidarity. This wasn't just his victory. It was ours. But pride wasn't the only thing in the air. Fear lingered too, because my family didn't surrender easily. I knew their patterns, their schemes, their manipulations, and I could see the wheels already turning behind their forced smiles and stiff nods. Some of them would try to adapt, pretend to respect him while plotting how to benefit. Others would dig in their heels, clinging to resentment, unwilling to bow to anyone, especially not the man they had spent so long tearing down. The suspense was unbearable. My father finally broke the silence, his voice sharp but quieter than I had ever heard it. "So you're saying, if we don't play by your rules, you'll cut us off?" My partner didn't flinch. "I'm not saying anything. I'm promising it." The boldness of it sent a ripple through the room. My mother gasped softly, her eyes darting between them like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But deep down, I knew she could, because for the first time, someone was holding them accountable. I watched as the pride drained from their faces, replaced by something they weren't used to feeling: humility, or at least the forced version of it. My aunt cleared her throat and murmured, "Of course, respect is important. We didn't mean to." But he cut her off with a look so sharp it silenced her. Watching their faces pale under the spotlight of truth, I felt those cracks sealing, stronger than before. But with vindication came heartbreak too. Because this was my family. The people who were supposed to protect me, cherish me, love me unconditionally. And yet they had failed. They had traded kindness for cruelty, loyalty for pride, love for elitism. Seeing them shrink now didn't erase the years of pain. It only highlighted how hollow they truly were. Still, I knew one thing. I wouldn't trade places again. I wouldn't choose their approval over his dignity. Never again. The dinner limped on, but the tension never lifted. Small talk was attempted, jokes were forced, glasses clinked half-heartedly, but the weight of his ultimatum pressed down like a storm cloud. The balance of power had shifted forever, and everyone knew it. Finally, when dessert arrived, no one touched it. My partner placed his napkin on the table, his voice final. "You don't have to like me, but you will respect me. And if you can't, then you'll lose her too. That's not a threat. That's reality." His words sliced through the air, undeniable, inescapable. And in that silence, I looked around the table, at the family that had mocked him, mocked us, mocked me. And for the first time, I realized something I never thought possible. And in that silence, I realized tables had turned forever. Betrayal carves wounds, but sometimes those wounds heal into scars that remind you of your strength. The night after that fateful dinner, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, every detail replaying in my mind like a film I couldn't pause. The laughter that had once cut me like glass, the humiliation that had soaked through my skin, the pride I had swallowed to sit at their table. The moment my partner's calm words shifted the entire atmosphere. All of it played over and over. For the first time, though, I wasn't drowning in shame. I was floating in something else entirely. Vindication. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel pride instead of pain. For so long, my family's voice, he had given me both, even when I wasn't brave enough to claim them for myself. The days that followed weren't easy. My family scrambled to recover, but nothing went back to the way it was. Some relatives offered hollow apologies, their words dripping with forced sincerity. Others stayed bitter, whispering about me when they thought I couldn't hear. But I didn't care anymore. Their opinions no longer felt like chains. They were just noise, and for once I had the choice to turn the volume down. I walked through my parents' house differently now. I no longer bent my shoulders under their disapproval. I no longer sought their nods of approval like a starving child begging for scraps. I had tasted freedom, and there was no going back. The dynamic had shifted forever. My partner was no longer the loser at the table. He was the man they couldn't ignore, the one they now scrambled to impress, the one they whispered about with awe and envy. But to me, he was the same man he had always been. the one who held my hand when the room turned against us, the one who stayed calm when I wanted to scream, the one who had chosen to reveal his truth not to crush them, but to protect me. And that was the true victory. Not the wealth, not the silence that followed his reveal, not even the shame that painted their faces. The real triumph was realizing I had loved him before I knew any of it, that when they called him a loser, I saw a man. When they laughed at his old car, I saw a partner who always showed up. When they mocked his clothes, I saw someone whose heart was rich in ways they would never understand. That love, untainted by appearances, had passed the harshest test, and it had emerged stronger. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think about what would have happened if he had never revealed his wealth. Would I still be fighting my family alone? Would they still sneer, still whisper, still call him names? Probably. But now I know it wouldn't have mattered, because the truth I discovered wasn't just about his money. It was about my own strength. I didn't need their approval. I never did. And yet, I can't deny the satisfaction of justice. Watching their smugness crumble, their arrogance melt away, their superiority dissolve into shame. It was a kind of redemption I hadn't dared dream of. Betrayal had turned into justice, cruelty into consequence, humiliation into power. But even up for you when the world turns cruel. It's the way they steady your hand under the table, whispering strength into you when you feel like breaking. It's the way they choose truth over comfort, even when it costs them. My partner gave me that love. And no amount of money, no flashy reveal, no jaw-dropping moment could ever compare to the quiet nights when he looked at me like I was enough. That's the wealth I'll never stop cherishing. But for my family, the lesson remains a scar. They will never look at him the same way again. They will never be able to erase the night when the loser they mocked turned out to be the man they could never afford to lose. And neither will I. They mocked him as a loser, but he turned out to be the man they could never afford to lose. If this story touched you, make sure to hit like and share it with someone who needs the reminder that love is bigger than status. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been judged by appearances or proved someone wrong? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss another powerful story of betrayal, justice, and redemption. And if you know someone who still thinks loser is a look, send this their way. Let's show them what real winning means.